we're going to talk about fixing mental problems, originally inspired from the last podcast when you mentioned this idea. I don't even remember exactly what the quote was, but I put the note down to do this. And then the more and more I began to think about this, the more and more I began to, observe. So I started just like over the last week, started observing different people that I know who have certain problems going on in their lives. And I could not stop thinking about how many of our problems come from the way we think and how we process life and how,
like all of them.
yeah. Well, I mean, obviously there are external problems that happen, things that happen to us, but the problem comes really when those problems are able to get into our head.
Yeah, that's the issue.
Unable to get rid of them, right? So there's this battle of the mind that I want to talk about tonight. I want to poke and prod on, and what we're going to do is we're going to play a pseudo game. It's not really a game. It's more, but it's kind of a game. I'm going to ask a question. I won't ask it just yet. I'm going to ask a question to the audience. The audience is going to give their answers, and then we will work through each one of those. But I have a specific question for you when it comes to each one of those answers. So what we're gonna play a little bit of a game, like I said. But I have some other things we'll kind of do in the meantime to get to that point, give folks a chance to trickle in. And so right off the bat, there are two things I don't want you to talk about yet. So I'm going to say it right away so we don't just, shed all the answers to life and man's problems. But
42.
That wasn't one of the answers, so this is great. We're starting off on a good note. So when we're talking about mental problems, everything we talk about on this podcast is from a godly biblical perspective. Everything we're considering, and it's not Pastor Ford said this so many times, it's not this applies to the life outside church and Christianity, and this applies to Christianity only, and there are these big divides between the two. The problems, the issues, the things we talk about, the topics we cover, they are on both sides. They touch both ends of the spectrum because this is life. This is life and reality. And so there are non-believers who can, through this podcast, learn something and hopefully gain some level of knowledge that can bring you to an understanding of what reality really looks like, or you can, just continue to live in the hole if you want. But then there are other things that, touch on people who are more, we'll call it churched, and can bring them also to a place of what reality looks like. Because the truth is, both ends of the spectrum struggle with reality often.
Okay, so which is what we've been calling, religion.
Yeah.
So you have non-believers, you have religious people. They're both the same. They overlap each other.
Yeah.
And then you have the Bible, the Word of God, Christianity, which is not either of those things.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So when it comes to the issue of mental problems, I'm going to ask you a specific question, and this will be the question that kind of gives people time to fill in, and then we'll interject my question for the audience at some point in the beginning of the podcast. But I was thinking about mental problems, and like just thinking about, okay, what does the Bible say about mental problems? What does the Bible say about the mind? And tons of scriptures come up.
Yeah.
But the one was a story, and I personally am very drawn to the stories of the Bible. There's obviously like the doctrines, there's theologies, there's things you work through, and I love digging through those and learning, about, they're just statements that are made, that God makes, that God's people makes in the Bible. And so there are statements made that are truths and revelations and realities that we need to learn and digest and work through. But there are also stories where God is giving us a glimpse of how things work. And I love those stories. And one of those stories is in Daniel chapter 4. And it's a story of a king he's not a godly king. His name is Nebuchadnezzar, and he's the king over a city called Babylon. Actually, it's more of a nation. It's not really just a city. He is the king over a kingdom, and so it's very, very. They would have been like the, what would you call them back then? It was like they were like they were the Egyptians, then there was the Babylonians, and then there was Persians, and so you had these like different world rulers. That's probably the right. Yeah. So Nebuchadnezzar was a very great king, very great, big, strong ruler. But there comes this point where he has a dream, and he's got these God-fearing men under him who he's ruling over, and one of them is named Daniel, and he's the one that he's responsible, obviously, for this book. But in this story, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He lays down. I'm not going to read the whole dream, but I just want to point out a couple pieces here. He has this dream that a holy one came from heaven and called out in a loud voice, cut down the tree, top off its branches, and then he says, but leave the stump with its roots in the ground, with a band of iron bronze around it, in the tender grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven and graze with the beast. And then he says, let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of a beast, till 7 times have passed by. So this is going to be for a season. And so later on, Daniel comes, he interprets this dream and says, this dream is about you. You're the tree. Yeah. You're going to be cut down for a time if you don't repent. He gives him this kind of space of time. And then a year later, Nebuchadnezzar comes out, looks upon his kingdom, and says, what a great kingdom I have made with my hands. And so he takes full credit for everything that's happening. And then in Daniel 4:33 through 34, he says, at that moment, the sentence against Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from mankind. He ate grass like an ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like feathers, like the feathers of an eagle, and his nails like the claws of a bird. But at the end of those days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity was restored to me. And so this whole story revolves around a man who took credit for everything that was happening. He took his eyes off God, took credit for everything, instead of seeing it for what it is, that God had given him this completely, and then he loses his mind. And so the reason why I share that story is because if anybody was to just see Nebuchadnezzar in that state, and we see men like that all the time. You just go down to San Francisco, you see men who lost their mind like that. They're living like beasts. But that's a very extreme symptom. And then you look at other symptoms of people who have maybe lost their mind or have some deep mental issues. What you see often are the symptoms. If you were to just look at Nebuchadnezzar as he's eating grass, you would say that dude's crazy. Yeah. He's lost his mind. That's a very easy conclusion to come to. But the Bible, as it always does, gives us the bigger picture, the root of the problem. So there's where the game comes in. I'm going to ask the audience to give me symptoms of mental problems. When somebody has a mental problem, what are some of the symptoms that come from mental problems? You could call it the evidences or the things that people do outwardly that show you that they either have deep mental problems or just flat out are crazy. And so I'm gonna ask it like that. I just realized I haven't even pulled up the screen here, so give me a second here. And then the question I'm going to ask Pastor Ford while that answer is coming in is, if somebody were to ask you, again, we are always talking from a biblical perspective and the reality of life as it is, not as it's perceived, but as it is. If someone were to ask you to describe mental problems biblically, what would your answer be? And before you answer that, the two things I said I don't want you to talk about first is you can't talk about the root, you can't talk about the symptoms. So it's a challenging question.
Okay, give me the question again.
Okay, the question is describe mental problems biblically. But you can't talk about the root, can't talk about the symptoms.
Not sure what I'm supposed to do here.
It's a game. It's a game, like I said.
But so what? You just want me to give examples, or?
No, I want you to define mental problems without talking about the roots or the symptoms. Because remember, the symptoms are hold on.
Well, what am I left with? I think you're better off to tell me what I can say, because so, I mean, so here, pretty much erased everything that's. That would be like saying, okay, tell me about the alphabet, but don't use any of the letters. It's like, okay, I'm not really sure where to go with that.
Fair enough. I'll try to make it a little easier. I can't tell you what you can say. But what I can say is is obviously the root is going to be the cause of the mental problems.
Right.
And then the symptoms are going to be the outward expression of it. So what's going on in the mind in the middle? That's right. You have the cause, the start. There's something happening in the mind.
Yeah, I don't know that I can do that.
Come on.
No, seriously, I don't know that I can, because you're asking me to talk about something that's going on in somebody's mind, when this is happening, and you can't possibly do that without talking about symptoms or the root. I mean, how do you do that? I mean, I don't see how I could even do that. Like, okay. I could give examples. Like, I could say, okay, the guy who's, I mentioned it the other night. The Gadarene demoniac, would be what we would consider to be a classic. Somebody who's insane. But I'd have to tell you the symptoms of that. So we can't do that, right? We can't say he was cutting himself, because that's a symptom. And so I can't say that. So I'm not sure what I can say, any more than other than saying there's the Gadarene demoniac, and then leave you to go figure all that out for yourself.
So
what more could I say about it?
Okay. Let me try and phrase this a different way.
So I'm not sure how that's even possible.
Okay. Hang on 1 second. I feel like we can do this.
Well, not in such limited scope that you just gave me. We can't. Because, like I said, so what more can I say about the Gadarene demoniac except to talk about anything that has nothing to do with his mental illness? So, like, we can talk about how he's from Gadara.
I will give you
an
example.
And what Gadara is, and he's Decapolis. I could do that.
Yeah,
but
so I'm gonna give you a quote. It's a quote I came across. It was a quote I remembered, and I actually remembered it. I remembered it incorrectly, but I led back to this. This guy's an author back in the, I want to say 40s, maybe a little later than that. He's a guy named F. Scott Fitzgerald. Have you ever heard of The Great Gatsby?
Yes.
Yeah, so he's the guy that wrote The Great Gatsby. And he was, at one point, a successful author, but then wrote a bunch of books that totally just flopped.
Right.
His wife lost her mind, and he lost his fortune, in a sense. He really did go broke. He kept trying different things, different avenues, and nothing was successful. He dies, The Great Gatsby becomes a hit.
Yeah.
And blows up, and they made a movie out and everything.
Yeah.
And so... But he makes this statement, and apparently he made it in the midst of a lot of personal conflict and I don't want to say self-reflection. Probably he was unable to solve a lot of problems in his life, and so he thought in his mind, I still am sane. I'm still able to function, right? I don't know all his story, so that might actually be true, but he makes this statement and became a famous quote. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing opinions in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function.
That's called cognitive dissonance. That's not true.
Okay, so describe that.
What?
Describe that. What is? So we're talking about what's happening in the mind at the time. Cognitive dissonance is a mental problem.
Yeah.
Describe that. What's happening in the mind?
Well, how the natural functioning of the human mind is to not do that. It fights against that idea of holding two opposing views. It fights against that. The natural functioning, fully functioning mind it's comparing things and finding similarities and differences, and being able to establish reference points. Yeah, I mean, because you have to have reference points, and so that's the important element of sanity is you have to have reference points that are easily identifiable. And so, if you're the kind of, so like, for example, the ability to hold two different or opposing points of view in your mind at the same time, the idea of doing that, means that you have to remove reference points, because if you have opposing points of views that you're holding on to, then okay. So, for example, to consider yourself normal my son and I went out Sunday, and there was this woman who was screaming her head off, absolutely screaming her head off. She was talking, like she sounded like, somebody giving a speech. She was yelling. I mean, really yelling, and she went on and on. It was like I told my son, I said, I'm surprised that she's not gone hoarse already. I mean, she's yelling so loud, and saying things. And, that's not normal, And the only way you can say that that's not normal is simply because normal people don't do that. It's not like it's a common thing to walk down the street and to see people just speaking at the top of their lungs while walking down the street. I mean, I'm not talking about trying to, speak something, to give some kind of wisdom or whatever. I'm talking about just literally rambling, at the top of your lungs while walking down the street and spouting disconnected sentences that, that they're not even going anywhere. There's no cohesiveness of thought or anything like that. If you're normal, then you're going to say, I can't do this. I shouldn't be doing this because this is not normal. And you will stop doing it. You can't say, what I'm doing, I know other people think it's not normal, but I think it's normal, so I'm going to do it. And therefore I'm normal. That would be holding two opposing points of view and making them work. But you're actually crazy because it's not true. I can act in a way contrary to sanity and still be sane. And it's like, no, you can't. If you're acting in a way that is insane, then you are acting insane. It's not, you can't get rid of that. So you have to be able to, there has to be some sort of consistency in your thinking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're getting we're getting a lot of great answers here. So it's funny. Sometimes the answers that come in lead me in kind of a different direction, and it becomes fun to process, and honestly a little surprising. So when we're talking about mental problems, it's easy and it's great that I don't. This is totally not. I hope this doesn't come across like I'm saying something bad about the answers, but the answers are, and I'll read through them. Talk to themselves. So when the question was, what are some symptoms, outward expressions of mental problems?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And these are the answers that have come in. Talk to themselves.
Not necessarily.
Hold on. So I think it depends on the person's disposition. Various types, various things. The paranoia, depression. So many different ways mental problems can manifest. Self-harm, seeing things that aren't there, believing things that aren't real, comfortable or being used to living on the street and comfortable or used to begging for money. Mm-hmm. And then we have a couple questions, and I'll get to the questions in just a second here. Yeah. But so it's interesting because when I mention mental problems, immediately our minds, well, I should say for sometimes what will happen is our mind will tend towards people in situations like Nebuchadnezzar. Mm-hmm. They're eating on grass. They're acting like animals. They're yelling at themselves and or at the sky. Yeah. And so we take this to this really, really crazy extreme. Or it's not crazy extreme. It's an extreme. Yeah. But what I'm hoping for is that we can bring this back to the middle and see that mental problems are much more common than those.
Well, situations. that was some of the things that you mentioned. I was thinking about those some of those ideas and things that you're talking about, like being comfortable, like if you isolate them out, being comfortable with asking for money is clearly a mental illness, except for one fact, is that it is also, for some, it's been normalized. And the actual act is not the issue. The act is not the issue. The issue is feeling that, because, in our society, we know that the only people that are that qualify who are getting free money are people who are some way disabled. They're incapable of being able to raise money on their own. And so the mental illness part of it isn't so much the actual asking for money, but the belief that you have the capacity to be able to raise money. But because of, whatever other, reason that you will insert in there, it's okay for you to beg for money. Mm-hmm. And so that's the mental illness is there, because somebody for example, I've heard this similar story in different places, is I remember when I went to England, coming from America, going to England, and the first 3 months I could not get, I literally could not get a job. I didn't even get a return phone call from anybody that I had applied with. Zero. And I was very aggressive at doing this. And I thought, man, I figured that it was going to be difficult, but I didn't figure it was going to be nothing. And so I start doing what, I learned in America, and I'm going to these places and I'm knocking on doors and just literally asking people. I'm just randomly going to places and looking, hey, is there, and well, okay, we'll get back to you, kind of a thing. And so it's like, so what ended up happening is I thought, man, I'm going to need to get money, I need money, I'm not doing well. And so, so I thought, okay, well, I'll humble my pride and I'll go down to the unemployment and get on unemployment until I can find a job. But this is going to be something that's going to be very short. I'm not going to do for a long period of time, because I need to get a job. I just need to get a job, and then I won't have to do this anymore. And so I'm in line, and I'm looking at the people that are in line, able-bodied people that are in line, but unemployable by just looking at them, because they haven't shaved, they haven't combed their hair, they're wearing like thrift shop clothes, and the whole line, the majority of the people in line. I'm sure that it wasn't the whole line, but that's all I saw. Is the majority of the people in the line, they all fit that MO, that they fit that profile. And I thought, that's not me. I'm not getting in this line. It's just not going to happen. I'd rather die first, and it wasn't pride. It was that I realized that the system, the unemployment system, was not really helping people. Mm-hmm. It was enslaving people, and they had learned how to subsist. And so I was against the system. I don't like that system, because these are people that if they would work, and it would take some time, but if they would work, they could make more money than they were making through unemployment. But I learned after living in England for so long, and that's why if you're interested in socialism, you don't have my vote, because I've seen what happens. I've seen literally what happens through socialism. And so when I saw that, and I saw all these people in line, and I saw this, and I thought, these people should be working. They're not working, and I'm not working, but I didn't go, oh, I want to be one of them people. I want to be one of those people. I'm going to go and get my thrift store clothes and not comb my hair and then learn how to subsist. No, that wasn't my goal. My goal was I'm going to get a job. And you might look at that and you might think, well, just because those people are scamming the system. No, that is the system. It's not a scam. It is the system. It's what the system has produced. And that's why you didn't see 3 or 4 or 5 people in line like that. You saw a lot of people in line like that. If I would have seen a lot of people in line like me, I'm having a rough time getting a job, but they're still dressed nice and they're still, trying to be presentable. Okay, fine. This is something that's temporary. All of these people at some point are going to get a job, but it was quite clear that these people weren't going to do that. And so the idea of getting free money, I wouldn't do it in that particular situation, because I thought, this isn't right. I'm not going to support this system by taking money from them. And you say, oh, well, that just means that the system is just going to be, but it's my own sense of normalcy, of what is normal, is that any decent human being is not going to join this thing. It was like a scam. This wasn't like a legitimate thing that was helping people to get to bridge. And so I said, forget it. I'm not doing this, And so as a result of that, what was interesting is that even though, and I was struggling, I was still, even after that, I was still struggling to get a job. I'm praying, I'm believing God, so I'm not going to disconnect Christianity from this. I'm doing everything that I can on all sides of the fence, to try to get a job. And a guy out of the blue who I didn't even know, he calls me. He was a pastor who was in our fellowship, but I didn't know him. And he called me and he said, I just wanted to welcome you to England. I heard that you came and I got your phone number and I just wanted to call you and just ask, so how's it going? How are you doing? You're coming over here from America. How's it working out for you? And I said, terrible. I said, it's not working out at all. I can't get a job. And he said, well, what have you been doing? I said, I've been doing what I've been taught to do. I've been writing out my resumes and going into companies and, knocking on the door and calling places and they're all nice and friendly. And then I walk away and nothing. And he goes, oh, he says, because I told him that he said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm an IT professional. And he goes, oh, he said, well, we don't hire like that here. It's not done. It's just not done. And I said, well, how do you do it? He said, well, we do it through agencies exclusively. They hire IT professionals through agencies. You don't just show up and talk about how wonderful you are and then you get a job. It's not like that. They go through agencies. And so having lived in America, I understand. We've always done it this way. We don't change anything for any reason. That's England. I mean, England has been around for thousands of years, and it'll be around for thousands of more years, and it'll be exactly like it has been for thousands of years. It's not a place where things just change overnight. There's just no such thing. I'm sure that I could go back there and almost everything will be the same, even though I haven't been there for 15 years. I could probably take you to the same places, and there's no new developments, there's no new nothing. It's the same. The old developments just keep getting redeveloped. They don't make new stuff, and I mean, not that exclusively, but I mean, not like we do here. I mean, you can leave a town for 15 years and then come back, and the town's gone. And something else it's been paved over, and it's something completely different. That's not the case. But so my point in all that is that once I realized, I went to an agency. And they walk me through it. Okay, yeah, give us your resume and this and that, and so we'll get it out. Within weeks, I think a week or two, I got job offers. And then I went, did the interviews, and the interviews went great. But so my point in all that is the idea is when I was at that unemployment line and I saw what I saw, and that understanding of what's normal, I'm not going there. I'm not going there. And you might think, oh, well, what if things didn't work out for you? What if things didn't go the way that you wanted them? If you're a normal person, things work out for you. Mm-hmm. You don't give up being normal, simply because you're having a hard time. Mm-hmm. And that is I think that's the real problem is that people give up. And so they surrender normal in order to survive's not even the right word. Subsist. I mean, it's just game over. Like I said, all these people, they're together. They probably have known each other for years. They show up there every morning, and I think if you would just have put a little bit more energy into life, you wouldn't have to do this. Yeah. You wouldn't have to live this way.
So we have a bunch of chatter here on the on the chat here. So let's get to some of these questions. So JDM, I don't actually don't know your initials. So welcome to the podcast. If this is your first time, if it isn't your first time, forgive me. I don't recognize the name. But there's a difference between mentally ill and demon possessed. I'm actually going to read a few questions because there's a couple related to this. There's a difference between mentally ill and demon possessed. this person got to that place because something happened to their heart? ?
So,
and then there's another question: what's the difference between mental problems and demonic possession or influence in someone's life?
Yeah. So I wouldn't want to go too far into the idea of trying to make a large distinction between mental illness and demonic possession, because mental illness is the creation of a vacuum. There's a vacuum that has been created, and there are a book that I'm interested to read is it's a book of a girl. She's growing up, and I haven't read it yet. But the what caught my attention about it is it's a woman who has been diagnosed as being a sociopath, but she grew up realizing she was different. She realized she wasn't like other people. And so I'm interested in the book because isn't it interesting that even though she's a sociopath, she has a mental illness. She recognizes that she has a mental illness, and so that's, to me, that's a very, very telling thing that even if you are crazy, or you've got some kind of issue, in your life, that you know that you've got something. And I know that's not true of everybody. I know you have people that have, it's more severe, Down syndrome and things like that are more severe. And but I wouldn't, the devil's not a respecter of persons. The devil's not a nice guy. I'm not sure how to say this with any measure of safety, is that I'm not surprised that people that have mental illness issues tend sometimes to do things that are socially unacceptable. And that I believe, because I think the devil's very cruel. I think he takes advantage of those things in people, and so I wouldn't put a lot, the point that I'm making in this is that I wouldn't put a lot of energy into the idea of trying to distinguish when somebody's demon possessed. I don't think that matters, because even if you're fully 100% demon possessed, it's still going to appear to be a mental illness. Like I began to talk about the Gadarene demoniac, the things that he did, cutting himself and breaking chains and all those kinds of things. These are not normal behaviors, but they are things that we would look at and say, people can do that have mental illness. You've heard, no doubt people have heard, and I won't go into the details of it, but just incredibly superhuman, sometimes, type of things that people can do to themselves, when they're crazy, like I've heard of, I'm trying to think of something softer, but it's not there, of somebody cutting their own, cutting themselves open.
Yeah.
Literally cutting themselves open and pulling out their innards. And it's like, how can you do that? How are you able to do that? You're crazy. It's like, I think there might be a little bit more going on there, than just the fact that they have a mental illness. Yeah. So I wouldn't put a lot of too much into trying to make a distinction between where the devil starts and where mental illness begins. I think they work together. And the truth is even if you are demon possessed, that didn't just happen by accident. Yeah. There's been something that opened the door for that.
Yeah. So okay. There's another question. I'm gonna quote or mention here, and then there's we'll work through this quickly because I want to pivot here. So what I saw a lot working in San Francisco for the better part of 30 years was what looked like rumination, people arguing with people from the past. I saw that every day in different people. Is that mental illness or demon possession? And then, well,
like I said, that's the thing, is you can't try to. Yeah,
he actually qualifies.
I don't think there's any need to say whether it's one or the other. The bottom line is that I think even with mental illness, it doesn't exclude God from the equation,
right?
And neither does being demon possessed exclude, oh, you're demon possessed. Oh, no problem. You can be delivered. Oh, you have a mental illness. Well, that's different.
Yeah.
I don't think that really it is that cut and dry. I'm not an on-off light switch type of thinker anyway. That everything has various degrees, and it doesn't mean that so it doesn't mean that somebody who's demon possessed can't be brought under control using drugs. And so it's not, it's not. It would be nice if they were like so neatly categorized, but they're not.
We did a podcast a while back on demons. I can't remember the title of it. I'll have to find it later. Anyway, I'm on a tangent here. So the other post that came in, or the other question that came in, is what are the possibilities of a person being mentally ill due to pride? Is that what happened?
Well, now we're starting to get into the more root causes of things. But that is the issue, because that is Nebuchadnezzar. It was pride that did that, and I think to drill down just a little further, it's the idea. It's kind of like what I said. My title of my sermon on Sunday morning is "You Write Yourself a Pass." Nebuchadnezzar knew the ramifications of. This is what's going to happen. You're going to, if you rise up in pride, this is what's going to happen. You're going to be eating you're going to be an animal. You're going to lose your mind. I mean, let's just put it there. You're going to lose your mind. If you do this, you're going to lose your mind. And then he does that. Well, why does he does that? Because he doesn't believe that he's going to lose his mind. I'm above that. I'm beyond the ability to lose my mind. And this is the thing, is that people, they write themselves a pass. And one of the things I was thinking of in relationship to that idea is, that people who, they believe that they can do certain sins.
Yeah.
That it's okay for them to do certain sins. They claim to be a Christian, but it's okay for them to do certain sins. It's not going to, I'm not like this, so that sin's not going to be a problem. And they don't get the idea. The proper understanding is that it's universal. It's not dependent on other things. The effects of sin on the human personality are the effects of sin on human personality. And the reason why it affects different people different ways is because they have a different type of personality. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't become a bondage, and it also doesn't mean that it won't equate out to worse things left unchecked. So that's that whole idea. You may not go out, and not everybody who's not a Christian goes out and becomes a serial rapist. It's not like that's how you know whether you're too involved in sin. Once you cross the line and you go out and you start raping people or murdering people, you've crossed the line. You've sinned too much, and that's why you're doing that. No, that's not true at all. It's not even anywhere near true, because you're already dealing with some mental illness by the mere fact that you actually believe that you can sin certain sins, and there won't be any ramifications for it. Yeah. And so which is funny, because that's the beginning right there. Is that I can sin with impunity, and so these particular sins, and so you are already dealing with, you've already created an opportunity so that your mind can be hijacked by the devil. You're already there. Yeah, I mean, you're already there. You've already made yourself mentally vulnerable just by the mere fact that you believe, even if you haven't done it yet. By the mere fact that you believe, if I did this, it would be okay, and I know it's wrong. You are already in a place where you are now vulnerable. It would be like somebody walking out of their house, and they've got. I remember when I was in Nigeria, and I changed like $50, I think it was $50 or $100, I can't remember, in Nigeria. And I'm walking across the parking lot. The person who took me there, they stayed in the car. And I'm walking out to the car, and I go, and because they gave me 2 shopping bags full of money. because the Nigerian currency was so bad. And I go, look, I said, this is crazy. Look how much money I have. And I'm saying this at the top of my lungs in Nigeria. And I have 2 bags of money in my hands. And it's like, that's stupid. And I'm like, oh, you idiot. When I realized this, because I'm thinking it's only $50.
Yeah.
$100. This is, to me, that's pocket change. It's $100 in America. That's not a big deal. This was gonna, this money that I'm carrying, is like because we didn't know how often we're going to change, and that that money was going to last me for a week. Well, that's pretty cheap. I mean, really, a couple of $15 a day, to live your life. I mean, I'm sure most people spend $15 a day, through their lives, all the things that they have to pay for, especially if you're staying at a hotel and you're paying for taxis every day, and you're, I mean, it's nothing. But I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, look at this. You'd think I was rich, and all I did is just change $100. Well, it's like anybody around me who's a thief is looking at this. $100 is a big deal.
Yeah.
I'm like, duh, stupid. Well, when you go walking through your life and you go, hey, you know what? I can sin and it's not going to make any difference because this sin isn't a big deal. You're just asking for trouble.
Yeah. Okay, so we're actually getting a little bit more in the direction that I was hoping to go with this. Again, we can look at, so we've been saying the word illness, mental illness, and that automatically has a lot of connotations with it. So we can kind of assume where that leads. But mental problems, we can disguise that. It's not necessarily an illness. You know what I mean? It's just a problem in your thinking, right? So we can overlook.
I will. I don't know exactly where you're going with that idea, but there's no difference between the two.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah. There's no difference.
That's
between
the point.
The two.
But
if you're having
when
mental
we say
problems,
mental
then you have
illness,
mental illness
versus mental problems, like everybody has mental problems, but not everybody has mental illness.
Yeah.
And so we separate the two.
Yeah.
And when we have mental problems, we don't see them that way. So the reason why I say that is because there's a scripture.
Well, it's just justifying mental illness.
Right. So when the Bible talks about a man who prays with doubt in his mind. He's praying, but he's doubting it's going to happen. James 1, verse 8, he says, let him not think he's going to receive anything from God. He's a double-minded man.
Yeah.
The word double-minded is very interesting. And we're talking about demon possession. We're talking about mental illness. It means to be of 2 souls or double-spirited.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting.
Yeah. Which isn't normal.
Right?
Yeah, that's the issue. It's not normal.
Exactly. But what he's saying now, that has all kinds of crazy consequences attached to it. You cannot come to God with a request because your mind is split in 2 different directions.
Yeah.
God's not going to answer your prayers, which means eventually you're going to stop believing God's real.
Right.
And so because he's not doing anything in your life. You're not seeing him do anything.
Yeah.
And so my point in saying that is that that's a very common thing. For people to, I believe in God, but I would never ask him for anything because I know he won't answer my prayers. Or I do pray and nothing ever happens.
Right.
Because there's mental problems.
Yeah.
And so my main question here is, when we look at Nebuchadnezzar, hopefully in the next 15 minutes, so this is 7:43, I'll just throw it out there now. If you have off-topic questions, you can pump them in now. Just put, in parentheses or put, off-topic, colon, and then ask your question, and at the end of the podcast we will get to those. But before we get that direction, we have to at least establish at least a common root, and then the solution, because the title of the podcast is Fixing Mental Problems. And so how do we do that? So when we look at Nebuchadnezzar, it's this really bad extreme, and I think the Bible gives us a lot of extremes, but we can take those extremes and apply them to everyday things we see all the time.
Yeah.
So if you were to look at, now if I was asked the question like this, give me an example that's much more common to man, or something that we would readily admit is common, that applies from Nebuchadnezzar's example. This for Nebuchadnezzar, he was eating grass, but for a common man today, what does that kind of mental disconnect lead to? Now, what are the symptoms?
You lost me there. What kind of mental illness comes from eating grass? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you're.
Okay. So when we look at his example, how can we apply where he ended up to today? in today's world, right? Okay, we can identify with the street guy.
That's the thing is that this just happened. This was that was a judgment of God on his life, and so I think the thing to glean from that is that reality is that you can be one day just fine, and you can cross the line, and you're not fine anymore, and it doesn't have to be something that just falls apart over time. Now, again, that's, we can make the distinction between, that and birth defects, which result in mental illness. And so you have those things, but I would categorize them differently because, somebody who is born, and this is, I know we're in a real moral, gray area when it comes to this idea, but I think when you look at it from a perspective, a biblical perspective, and then at the practical level as well, is I've been to mental institutions and to being a pastor, you end up in all kinds of places, and that being there and observing, the patients that are there. A lot of them are religious. A lot of them are very, very religious, but in a bad way. They're not religious they're dressed like priests and monks and nuns and things like that. Something brought them to that place, and even people who are not in the that are out in the streets. I've met people who are, they're Elijah, John the Baptist. They seem to be the most popular, those two. And I've run into Jesus a few times, but not as much as Elijah and John the Baptist. John the Baptist seems to be the most common. But what brought them to that place? To think that, because it's not, the Bible doesn't say anything about any of these people showing up right now. Jesus, when Jesus shows up, it's not, the world isn't going to be like it is now. It's going to be different. He's not just showing up. And so these are based on personal feelings, thoughts, personal preferences, those kinds of things. But it doesn't, like what I'm saying is, it doesn't, once you start to entertain those kinds of thinking, that kind of thinking, that's when you're most vulnerable. Mm-hmm. That's you have people who have nervous breakdowns. It's a thing. It's not fake. And you have people that they become, the problems of life get on top of them and they break. And so it's not that these things don't happen. They do happen, but the disconnect, really, when it comes right down to it, the disconnect more often than not is we've created that environment in our minds because we don't have the right tools to handle it properly. And I think that's where, like I said, it's kind of a moral gray area, is that, I'm crazy, so I'm not responsible. I was diagnosed as, having some mental illness, so it's not my fault. It's like, well, not necessarily. You may have created that environment and by decisions that you've made, and it's going to require honesty in dealing with those things. Then there's the other things, which is what kind of, I think, led us into this podcast in the first place, as I was talking about, I'm very aware of my own mental illnesses, and that I could talk from personal experience on my mental illnesses. But I'm sure if I went to a doctor, I don't know this for 100% fact, but I'm sure I probably wouldn't be diagnosed, as having any kind of severe mental illness, because I can still function within the realm of the normal day-to-day life issues without medication or things like that. And so my wife may disagree, my kids may disagree, but that's just my opinion. But anyway, I'm high functioning, whatever my mental illness is high functioning. And so, but but when you understand, where you are in real life, when you really understand these things, then these things don't become such a problem. That's why I'm really kind of looking forward to reading this book once it comes. I put on hold on it. It's a library book, and I put a hold on it, waiting for it to come through. And I'm kind of excited about reading it, because I'm curious to see how this transpired. What happened, because the summary talks about how she didn't have the emotions of normal kids. She saw kids and people react certain ways, and was like, I don't react like that. I don't have that kind of reaction, and I can identify with that, because there are reactions that I'm like that. But having been around for a little bit and lived in different countries, we all seem to react differently to different things all the time, and so it's not something I'm worried about. Other people worry about it more than I do, but it's not. I'm not worried about it. I'm not going to. I don't find joy out of killing animals, or things like that. So it's like, I think I'm okay. But I think really the help, of mental illness really comes down to the identification of it first. I think that's a very important element. And for those that, and even as a pastor, there are people that I think, it would be beneficial for them to be on some kind of medication, at least initially, so that they could get a benchmark of what normal looks like. And then they could try to work towards that, by tapering off on the medication and realizing that, there's certain ways that you're supposed to think, and that perhaps maybe you. So I'm a big fan of the big term neuroplasticity. I'm a big fan of the idea is that we can learn how to be brain programmers. A great phrase that I heard. I don't know if this originated with him, but Greg Rochelle, is that his name? I can't remember. Craig Rochelle. I think it's Craig Rochelle. Becoming a thought warrior. And it's a great idea, because the idea comes from the scripture of taking every thought captive. Mm-hmm. And that idea is you learn how to say, no, that's not. I'm not accepting that thought. That thought crosses a line. And it doesn't matter how real the thought is, or how a part of your personality it is, or any of those things. It doesn't matter the emotional response that you have to it, and the rational process that goes on is to be able to just simply have a benchmark for rational thinking, or what would, and I know normal is relative, in a lot of ways. Normal isn't normal. I mean, it's normal to some people, not normal to everybody. And so, but the point that I'm making in that is being able to establish a benchmark that allows you to function socially. I think is very important. And if that requires drugs, then it requires drugs. If you can do that through prayer and reading the Word of God. And I'm not talking about I'm jumping tracks on this, because I'm not talking about the Bible as therapy, or prayer as therapy. I'm talking about if you can literally, you can allow the Word of God to train or retrain your thinking. Because you begin to understand from a biblical perspective what God says is normal. And then you're on the road to recovery, because the fact that you can submit yourself to that, even if it's a violent act of bringing every thought captive, you're literally a thought warrior. You're killing the thoughts that end up in your mind that are wrong, that shouldn't be there. Then you're on the road to recovery. By definition, you are. And in the beginning, it may be something that you have to do manually. And very, very, it's going to require a lot of effort and energy. But like many things, like learning how to ride a bike or play an instrument or anything like that, in the beginning, it's always more difficult, and once you establish, you wrap your head around it, and your body can begin to respond involuntarily. You just simply do it because you've been training yourself how to do that. It's funny because playing keyboard, I never really learned how to play keyboard, but I took it was about 2 months of intensive practice, and then I could play for song service. And then I stopped, because after that I showed my daughters how to play, and now I don't actually play as a hobby. And so, but I can sit in front of a keyboard, and within an hour or so I'm back up. It's coming back to me, and it's like, oh yeah, and the muscle memory is starting to begin to work again, because it's something that has become part of a whole new the subconscious thinking process. And so there's a lot that can be done at a physical level to reestablish, or to establish for the first time a mental benchmark.
Yeah.
But it's not all just mechanical, because we are spiritual, and so that I don't discount that idea of it, because the truth is a lot of the reason, or a lot of the benefit of like I mentioned before, I can't remember her name, but this woman who's intelligent woman, she was involved in religion, became an atheist, very, very aggressive and active atheist, basically, mentally fell off a cliff and didn't know how to recover. She just plain didn't know how to recover. And I don't know if it was a friend or what, but somebody had told her, you have rejected the spiritual element. Maybe that's your problem. Maybe you fell off this mental cliff because you have neglected who you are spiritually. And so told her, why don't you try praying? And so she really did genuinely try praying, and it led to a recovery, which eventually led her to becoming a Christian. A very intellectual atheist becoming a Christian, because she was able to spiritually get out of the hole of something that she couldn't do any other way. And so I don't think of that as a last-ditch effort. What I'm saying is there's such a power in the understanding of who we are and that we're created, and being able to come into a relationship with God. The reality of God is manifest in that kind of an environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is where you're gonna find health spiritually, because that's a layer below. The mental, and that's the thing I think is funny is that atheists always think that Christians are stupid, and Christians are actually more intelligent. They're more intelligent than non-Christians, because non-Christians still have rationale, the logic and reason. They still have all those elements there, and in addition to that, they have spirituality. In addition to that, so they actually have more going on than an atheist. An atheist has abandoned part of the physiological makeup of what it means to be human, and so they've abandoned that, and so they're the actual handicapped ones. And so they think Christians are stupid by choice. Oh yeah, well, you're going to believe in that stuff. Well, you can't believe in logic and reason anymore. You can't believe in science. You can't believe in this, and none of that's true. But for the atheist, they are actually physically handicapped, because they have abandoned spirituality to be like somebody who's decided they're not going to use their arms anymore. It will atrophy, and they may be very intelligent. They could be, so like for example, Stephen Hawking. His whole body's offline, but his brain is a very, very intelligent individual. And so, yeah, great, very intelligent individual. And he was born that way. It's not his fault that this happened. But what if you saw somebody like that who is very, very intelligent, who's wheelchair bound and unable to communicate except through the means like Stephen Hawking, because of choice? Would you really be looking at somebody like that and talking about how intelligent they are? Why would you choose that? Why would you choose to atrophy your entire existence in order to stay true to your mind? Why would you do that? That seems extreme and unintelligent, to do that. And so there absolutely has to be an understanding that there's a spiritual dynamic that is what underlies all of that. And so all of the physical interactions of chemicals and mental processes, all of those things they're built on the foundation of spirituality. We're born with a fully developed spirit, but we're not born with a fully developed mind. And so I think it's very important to understand that is the way out, of mental illness, is understanding that you are more than just a brain.
Yeah.
Is very, very critical, because a lot of the, it's like, somebody who, people come back from war, stepped on a landmine or something like that, or been shot or whatever, and now they're paralyzed, they've lost the use of their body in some way, and they're like, I don't want to live the rest of my life, laying on a bed, and that may be how things start. But there's something that happens spiritually in those that actually recover, and they are now more than what they were before. They're not less. They're more than what they were before. There's a woman named Joni Eareckson Tada who's a good example of that. She always a Christian, just out playing, dove off of a ramp, hit a I think it was a rock, and that was it. She's paralyzed. I mean, literally paralyzed from the neck down, and she's got very minimal ability to move her hands around. And her story, she talks about all the mental anguish and the mental difficulties that she went through in all of that. But she was able to build that all back up again as a person. She was able to rebuild all that through her spiritual, because she wasn't hurt spiritually, she was hurt physically. And that built her back up again. And so the same thing's true with mental issues. It's the same thing. Is that if you'll go there, then there's recovery. But you have to go there, and it's not an easy thing to do, because you think, why did God allow this to happen to me, or whatever, and you're blaming God for your problems. You have to get out of that kind of thinking and start thinking from the standpoint of, how do I recover? How do I go on from this? And you can literally be more than you could have been by just being, physically okay, when you have a well-developed spiritual person. And of course, the ultimate, is to have both, but that may not be an option, but you don't have to, no matter what, your spirit doesn't have to be handicapped.
Yeah.
And so that is, and sometimes that's the only light at the end of the tunnel, is there's just spiritual reality that you can, like what Paul says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And understanding that at a physical level, not just simply the great thought, great idea.
Okay, so we're going to end on a few bullet points that I'm going to give, because this really isn't, it's not an academic topic, but has some practical application. You mentioned a few things, so I noted them down. But the first you mentioned is, it is possible to go too far, to be fine one day. So let's just kind of setting the stage here, setting the reality of the mind and how things can work out. As you said, it's possible to be fine one day and not the next. Mm-hmm. It's possible to cross a line. Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned that when we're dealing with mental problems, it's important to be able to identify the problem and that you have one.
Yeah. So the one thing though I want to go back to is it doesn't mean it's not, because that is it. I know the kind of thinking that goes on in religious people's minds is that mental illness is a curse from God, and so it just happens like that. It's not necessarily. You can go from one day to the next and go from good to bad. In terms of your mental stability, that can happen, but more often than not, it's a gradual decay, and that is equally as concerning, or should be as equally concerning, as just the idea of, I don't want to wake up and be insane, so I want to be right with God. So that's more than likely that's not going to be the case. It's going to be the little stupid decisions that you make that are going to be poisoning, your mental health. And you might, just wake up one day and you've been drinking spiritual bleach, and now all of a sudden you have all these, mental problems because you've been, subtly dealing or subtly poisoning your mental processes.
So it can be a gradual decline.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not it's not going to be, oh, God's going to judge you and you're going to lose your mind, like Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
What doesn't?
Okay, and then again, the second one was it's important to be able to identify that you have a problem. I think that's
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Kind of seems like one of the
yeah,
places
absolutely.
where people get
well,
stuck. Though.
I would say but you know what I would say is the ability to be self-aware enough to know what your problems are. I don't think it's an issue of well, I'm doing pretty good. I don't have any problems. Like I say only half jokingly. Last week I enumerated my mental problems. But everybody has mental problems. It's everybody does. It's not. There's no such thing as a bug, but perfectly pure mind. There's no such person. That's the whole problem. That's the whole problem with the human race is that we don't have that. That's why we make selfish decisions. That's why we do it. So if you can't identify those things within yourself, then you're still in the same category of mental illness. If you're not, by identifying them, the mental illness becomes manageable. It's funny to me that like I said before, people, well, I haven't murdered anybody, I haven't done this, I haven't done that, I haven't done the other thing. I'm going to be probably next Sunday. Be talking about the kinds of decisions that people make in terms of just that they don't need anybody else and I don't need other people. I can function without other people. And it's like, well, says you. But the truth is, anybody who knows you, they don't agree with that. They don't agree with that at all. But you can't see it because you can't see the mental illness that's associated with the idea that you believe you don't need other people. And so that's a mental illness. It's a mental disorder to believe that you don't need other people and that you can just make your way through life without anybody. That's a mental disorder. There's no such thing.
Yeah. So then the third one was to establish a benchmark for normal. So
that's pretty. That's one of those turning a light switch onto something that's a dial.
How would you better state that?
I would qualify that under the idea of first acknowledging, recognizing your problems.
That's the second one.
Yeah, you have to have that first,
yeah.
and then. So the one can't live without the other.
Yeah, you said this linearly, so I'm just stating down what you
right. So yeah, I would say, and oh, by the way, I need to probably. I was going to actually get a pice of paper as a disclaimer. So I'm not a.
I forgot to do that.
I'm not a mental illness doctor. The truth is that I've been a Christian. I've been a pastor for 30 years. I've been a Christian for 40 years, and I have learned that my skill level, is that I can help anybody who's willing to listen to me and do it my way. But there are other people that are much more highly skilled, therapist type people that are much more highly skilled, that they have a bag of tools, of all different kinds, and they're able. And I've read different books by different things, and I thought I would have never thought of that. That would have never happened because I've got my way. I've got an example for it really quick. Is that I've learned how to do the Rubik's Cube. I can do it. It takes me a half an hour. Okay, so I'm never going to set a record. It's just never going to happen. And the truth is, I'm not really motivated to go that far, but I can do it. I can do it. But I do it. The reason why I can do it is because I have memorized like 3 algorithms. But to actually be the fastest, to get it in 5 seconds or something like that, there's like many algorithms that you have to be familiar with so that you can identify that algorithm in this circumstance. And that's why it takes me so long, is because I only use those 3 algorithms to complete the Rubik's Cube. But I can do it. And so I would compare that to where I am as far as being able to help people. I believe that I can help anybody as long as I only need to use the few algorithms that I know. And if they'll follow those algorithms, the result will be progress and beneficial, and they will come out of it, whatever their mental metaphysical problems are. I can help them to get there, you know, by, you know, obviously pointing them to Jesus and the Word of God and those kinds of things. But there's also, you know, how to learn how to rightly divide the Word of God, how to be able to recognize, you know, your own inadequacies, those kinds of things. Those are all the things that I can do. But people who are really, you know, they don't want to hear anything and they don't want to know anything, but they know they're crazy, you know, go to a therapist, because I can't help you. You know, I can't. If you're not going to listen to me and say, okay, I'm gonna try it your way, I'm going to do it the way that you say. If you're not willing to do that, I don't hold out a lot of hope that I can help you, because it's a, you know, it's the way I've learned how to do the Rubik's Cube. And so there's my disclaimer.
Okay, so you made a statement. So establishing a benchmark for normal. I'll say this in the context of your specific problem. Obviously, that's probably
my specific problem.
No. I'm talking about.
Oh, I was going to say, I don't have any problems. What are you talking
about? In order to find out where you need to be. So the fourth thing you said was related to spiritual health. Can you make a statement about that, like a one-liner?
Spiritual health, genuine spiritual health, has everything to do with, do you have a realistic, genuine, personal relationship with Jesus? Not your fabricated ideas of what that means, but a genuine one, biblically based, sound. And if you want to test it, go back to what I said earlier about the idea of the smallest of sins. If you write yourself a pass on the smallest of sins, you don't have a relationship with Jesus. Because that's the foundation of a relationship with Jesus, is to understand that all sin is wrong, all sin is bad. So that's very critical.
Very good. A genuine, I like that, realistic relationship with Jesus. That's a new one. That's a tool for my toolbox.
Yeah, well, you know, because when I became a Christian, you know, I knew that I wasn't a Christian before, but I've seen, you know, people who have any kind of a religious background, they will mix that in with their Christianity, and it can't help but turn it into a ritual. It's just a ritualistic religion, and the ideas and thoughts and where things are. It's okay to, you know, like you can look at people and, you know, like the Pharisees, you could look at people and you think, you know, I'm doing better than they are. You know, well, by definition, that's not Christianity, you know, but that's something that's very common. You know, something as simple as that, to be able to look at people and look down at them, you know, or to feel yourself superior to them, you know, is very easy to do, you know, and still go to church, you know, and be very religious and very, you know, and even claim Christianity and even claim that you have a personal relationship with Jesus, you know, but that's why I say, you know, sin all the way down, because the Bible condemns that.
Yeah.
You know, there's no getting around that. The Bible condemns that. And so, but if you think, oh, yeah, I know the Bible condemns that, but I can get away with it because I write myself a pass. God gave me a pass, you know, and so you don't really have a relationship with Jesus when you're like that. Can you be honest enough to be able to look at that kind of stuff is, I think, the most important.
One last question that's come up here is, what's not realistic besides giving yourself a pass on sinning? So in addition to...
What's not realistic?
In addition to, so you said a realistic relationship with Jesus.
What's... Okay.
So in addition to not writing yourself a pass.
Well, I'm only labeling that it's not realistic, because the truth is that if you can... think of the nature, the funny thing about that scripture, or that comment, is besides sinning. Well, you know, that's everything. You know, that is the reason why all this has happened to us, is because somebody decided that it was okay to eat the fruit, the guava, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that's all it took to bring us to where we are today. Mm-hmm. You know, and that, you know, to the higher species of evolved man, you know, it's like, oh, tut, how such a silly, narrow-minded way of thinking. It's like, no, that's what happened. Is the smallest of sins, nothing major whatsoever, destroyed all of humanity. And so that idea of besides, is there something else besides sin, is it's missing the exactly what I'm talking about. It's missing besides sin. That would almost be like saying, okay, so other than me murdering somebody, is there any other indication that I might have some kind of a mental problem? It's like, so what does that say about how you feel about murder? You're actually saying that, okay, I know murder's it's not a good thing. I get that. It's not a good idea. It's like, it's just not, that's all it goes, that's as far as it goes, is this not a good idea? It's like, but other than sin, what else can keep us from having a real relationship with Jesus other than sin? Well, sin's a big deal. It's like,
yeah.
How can let's deal with that first, entirely, become sin free, then ask that question. Because if you're sinning, then you're gonna have a problem having a relationship with God. And so let's work on that first. And the interesting thing about that is that when you realize, or when you deal with a batch of sin, it's funny how when you clear that out of the way, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's another batch of sin. And you clear that away, and it's like, oh, there's another one. And you realize this is going to be the rest of my life, dealing with sin.
Yeah.
And so that it's important to recognize that sin is everything, and if you're going to have a realistic relationship with Jesus, a genuine relationship with Jesus, your attitude about all sin is going to have to be the equivalent of any sin that you consider to be the worst.
So there's a little bit of a testimony here, and then we will end. It's 8:17 now. No other off-topic questions have come up. But personally, I isolated myself and got very mentally unwell all the time, knowing fully that I was in trouble but not able to get out of it. It wasn't until my prayer life changed that my mind changed.
No. It was that you stopped isolating yourself when it changed. It's funny because we can see the problem, but to actually be able to identify the solution sometimes is very difficult for us. Is that was the problem? The problem was the isolation, because the Bible says that's a sin. And so, I started praying, and so are you still isolating, yourself? And now you feel better about yourself being isolated, and you're mentally well, even though you're isolated because your prayer life got better? That's not how it works. It doesn't work that way. You deal with the issue. You deal with the particular issue itself, which is the isolation. I was isolating myself and I got unwell. I stopped isolating myself and I get well. You don't even need to start praying. I mean, whatever your religious disciplines are, that isn't what fixes you. What fixes you is when you stop sinning. Mm-hmm. And that's what goes back to the original thing that I said about even the smallest of sins. When you look at these as not a big deal, then it's very easy to think that wasn't my problem. My problem was something else. My problem, is like I was isolating myself. I was becoming mentally unwell. But when I started praying, then everything got better. Are you sure? Are you sure that that's what happened? Because you're still sinning. So are you sure that everything's better? You see what I'm saying? So that idea, and that's why, like I said, because it's so easy for us to excuse small sins, like isolating yourself. We can excuse that small sin and say, isolating myself is not really a sin for me. It might be a sin, for other people. It's not a sin for me, and I can compensate for that sin by praying more or better or whatever. And that isn't the case. That's not what happens. It's repentance. When you repent of sin, then things get better. Even if you're not praying, things get better. Just by repenting of sin. and so you have to be really careful because I've mentioned before. I won't go on because we've gone too long, but I mentioned before how I was working at a company and I was stoned, and so I screwed up. I was doing assembly work, and I had soldered all these things wrong. Basically there were these. It was a strip, and the strip had these. They're called. It's a terminal strip, is what it's called. You take you've probably seen them. Anybody who's seen any kind of thing where you put in a wire, and then you screw down the terminal, and that holds the wire to the in place. Well, what I hadn't screwed all those down before I soldered them, and so they were sitting up too high, and so the whole thing was all wonky. And I did a whole bunch of them like that. And my boss called me and said, "You've done this. You've wrecked all this." And the reason was because I was stoned. That's why, And so he said, "I want you to fix all these." And so I had to go away and fix them all. And so I'm desoldering all. There's like 14, 15, terminals in a block. And so I'm desoldering every one of these, taking it off, setting it back down, making sure they're all screwed in, and then soldering them all. And it's taking me like 5 minutes to do each one. And then I realize, you know what? If I just heat up one and then turn the screw down, and then another one, turn the screw down, turn another one, turn the screw down, I fixed this. And so I went into my boss and I told him, I said, "I have figured out a fast way fixing this problem." Mm-hmm. And he's like, great, great. And then fired me, that day.
I don't remember this story. You said you told this already?
Yeah. He fired me because it's like, you don't get it. You just don't get it. You caused this problem. Just because you came up with a solution for the problem you caused, you haven't dealt with the problem. Yeah. And the problem is you come in stoned. That's the problem. And we can do that. Well, I did this over here. I did this thing over here, and that fixed the problem. No, it's just covering up the problem. It's not fixing it. It's just covering it up. The problem still remains. Because you haven't actually resolved the problem.
Totally tell a couple stories of times you actually specifically told me that. I have quite a few stories like that, actually.
But so we can.
I forget how long we've known each other.
So we can wrap this up now. But that idea.
One last question.
Okay.
One last question. Is it sensible to think isolation is a symptom of mental illness? I'm thinking of people who enjoy isolation, like introverts, for example.
Well, there's a difference between being an introvert and isolating yourself. Somebody who's an introvert isn't comfortable being around people. That's a different story. That's something that has to be overcome. You're not comfortable being around other people. You have to. When people come into the church and get saved and they're introverts, that's one of the first things they have to learn how to overcome. And you can be. God can, there's a whole nother element for another podcast, but there is a such thing as deliverance. God can set us free from mental illnesses and mental problems like that. He can help us with that. We've had numerous people in the church that now they can grab a microphone and testify in front of a ton of people, and they were introverts when they got saved, and it 2 or 3 times behind the mic, in the confidence of who God is in their lives was enough to make them realize this is just garbage, for me to be an introvert. And so there is a place for that, but you have to see it for what it is. It's like, oh, I'm an introvert, so I get a pass.
Yeah.
I get a pass. I don't have to hang around with people. I don't have to, it's like
you isolate yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And the Bible very clearly, it says, "He who isolates himself rages against all wisdom." Yeah. I mean, it's the idea of somebody yelling at the top of their lungs, like what I said. They're yelling at the top of their lungs, screaming their head off, talking to the air about nothing, and they're crazy people. They're crazy people. This is what the scripture calls it. And you say, well, no, I'm actually quite normal. It's like, okay, you yell and scream and you walk down the street and people look at you and they're like, ooh, what's up with that guy? But in your head, you're normal. Well, that's mental illness, in its all its glory. Yeah.
So, all right, we're gonna end here. I want to put in a plug for next week. We're gonna do another podcast on the mind, and talking about not specifically mental problems, but we'll talk about the mind again. And honestly, I'm hoping that this it might keep going. There might be a couple more, but I'm hoping that you guys we can create an atmosphere where we can all leave with practical keys. And like you're talking about tool bags, and there have been dozens and dozens of times where you've said something or helped me in
well, you're going to have to prompt all that because I don't write these things down.
No, I mean, well, hopefully that's what I've been trying, getting better at doing through these 227 podcasts over the last few years now, is hoping to prompt and pull stuff out of you. But my hope though is that, because I have come out of some pretty serious mental problems, and genuinely was reflecting maybe a week ago. I was like sitting, I was talking to my wife, and I was like, mentally speaking, I never thought I'd be where I'm at.
Yeah.
And so to be able to think the way I do and see life the way I do has come from many, many rough conversations.
Yeah.
Where my mental problems were confronted, but also the path out was presented.
Yeah, so we can have a little therapy session.
Yes, we can have a therapy session. But yeah. And you're the older one now, so you're gonna have to
the older one what?
This is a horrible inside joke, but Pastor Olson's confession about becoming more weepy when he's older. Maybe you'll weep over some past memories. Maybe not. Anyway, sometimes is the sin that keeps us away from God also from others, family, friends, church. Is that something you guys agree?
Say it again.
Sometimes it's the sin that keeps us away from God, also from others, family, friends, and church.
Well, this is the thing about isolation is it's a two-edged sword.
Yeah.
It becomes cyclical because there's sin, and sin has corrupted our thinking, and now we become socially unacceptable. We struggle in social environments because we're on another planet, in our mind. And then that causes more problems, which causes us to become more, screw them, It's like, you really should stop and think about how many times you're saying, oh, screw them. How many people have you added to your hate list, or your I don't have anything to do with these people list, because that's a good indicator of the sin that's still functioning in your mind. Because like I can say in my own life, my own personal life is let me just say this. We maybe go into another podcast at some other point because we're going too long. But the one thing that, to me, the singular distinctive difference of Christianity and everything else, the top, I can't think of anything else that goes above this, is the ability to love your enemy. I can't think of anything else that transcends that. The ability to love your enemy. And I think that kind of answers that last question, is that's the issue, is that when you have come to that place where you are not able to love a particular enemy, but you were able to love your enemies, no matter who they are, the differences of opinion or whatever it is, when you're able to live there, then you're going to find that the idea of isolating yourself is no longer necessary. It's no longer necessary. It will just go away. You'll be able to have relationships with people who disagree with you. It's funny about family is that, especially if you're on different points of view politically, if you're a Christian, then that doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. It won't matter that you're on different political perspectives, because Christianity isn't politics. Christianity is something else. And so when you get into a disagreement with people over politics, your Christianity should transcend that. Your ability to love your enemies, or to love those who disagree with you, or spitefully use you, as the Bible says. And so, that's a very common issue. Is I have a good relationship with all of my family, and I've always had a good relationship, even with my all of my in-laws. Even though they are dyed in the wool, my father-in-law was a dyed in the wool, absolutely down to the ground atheist. My first introduction to him was his bumper sticker on his car that said, "Apes evolved from creationists." I knew we were not going to get along. from day one. I knew we were not going to get along, and I was able to build a relationship with him, and that when he died, there was no problem between us. There was no relationship issue. Part of his dying last words to me was, he said, "I'm glad you married my daughter." And so it's like, to me, that's Christianity. That right there, that's Christianity. I was able to bridge the gap between diametrically opposed to each other. I was able to bridge that gap, and that's because I'm a Christian. And so Christians are peacemakers. The Bible says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So Christians are peacemakers. They're not troublemakers.
Yeah.
So done.
All right, we will end there. Thank you for joining. Thank you for the comments, questions, and answers, obviously, to the questions I threw out there. I thought that went in a really good direction. So we'll be here again next week. As I said, we're going to talk about the mind again. Encourage you to look out for that title and to prepare to come and hopefully participate in the podcast. We set it up this way on purpose, and so join us. Let other people know about the podcast. Send the links out when you get them. Click the alarm or the little notification bell, and you can get notifications for when our events are going live or when we have a new one posted and ready to go. We post them a few days ahead of time, and so you can know what's coming up and plan for it. And we appreciate you taking your Tuesday night to join us. We will have more events coming up very, very quickly. As a matter of fact, the next month is going to be very, very busy. And so we'll have a lot going on. And super encourage you. I encourage you to meet us, to come and meet us in person if you haven't been to one of our services. Tomorrow night we will have our midweek service at 7 o'clock here at our church building. And we'll put that information on the screen. But if nothing else, we will be here again next week, Tuesday night, same time, same place, different topic. I look forward to being here again and hopefully meeting you soon.